Hi, welcome to the Analysis.news. I'll be back in just a few seconds to talk with Tom Ferguson about the debt ceiling debacle, the debt ceiling crisis, the debt ceiling theater. I don't know. Take your choice. Be back in just a second. Tom Ferguson is probably the leading expert in the United States on money and politics. He wrote the seminal The Golden Rule, the investment theory of party competition and the logic of money-driven political systems. He's also the director of research at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Thanks for joining me, Tom.
Glad to be here. Now, as the Pope said, I'm still alive.
So in a recent piece in Naked Capitalism, E. Smith referred to this debate over the debt ceiling as kayfabe. For those that don't know what kayfabe is, this is a term about people who believe professional wrestling is real and treat the theater or report on the theater as if it's actually the story. How much of this is theater? What is this thing really about?
Well, what it was about was an effort to cut spending sort of jointly administered by the Democrats and the Republicans, in which the Democrats didn't have to look like they were trying to cut spending, merely acceding to the pressure put under them unbearably by the Republicans. In other words, much closer to the professional wrestling example that you were just describing. Legally it was, are we going to raise the allowed level of borrowing by the government to pay debts, to pay off, in effect, the deficit, right? To keep it going. So what a surprise. All of the folks eventually decided they would do that. What they had to do it, though, was to get a compromise between the two major parties on what they were going to chop out of the budget. That the story is in brief.
Now they're forcing cuts to legislation Congress has already passed. So Congress has approved this spending. The House flips to the other party, and they're undoing something that Congress already said should be done. Am I getting that right?
Look, forgive me, as an old fan of Peanuts, you remember when who was it? Who was holding the ball for Charlie Brown, and then they would jerk it away when he went to kick it? That's sort of what's happening here. They're snatching the ball when everybody thought it was going to be a kick. Yeah. That's the theater aspect to it. That's the part that my colleagues, Paul Jorgensen, G. Chen, and I, we actually sort of focused on in our little piece on the debt ceiling debate. Because the puzzle here is pretty simple, Paul. It's like, as the New York Times put it, which must mean it's true, right? It said that the Democrats could easily have fixed this problem by raising the debt ceiling when they had both control of both houses of Congress. They chose not to do it. Instead, waiting, they could have done it in the little intersession, before the new Congress took over. They didn't do it. And instead, they decided they'd negotiate with the Republicans, to which the only sensible answer is, why on earth would anybody try to negotiate with the House of Representatives run by McCarthy and company over, say, public spending? If you didn't have to do it, far better to negotiate even with Joe Manchin, as lots of people said. They didn't do that. That's the theatrical.
That's the key to it. They had two opportunities to do that. They could have done that in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. They could have done it in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. So you got to go back to, I guess, your thesis on money and politics. Why didn't they do it? They could have done it.
It's like the perfect swindle, I'm sorry to say. You take a bunch of big donors. You're Joe Biden, and you got elected by appealing to basically large numbers of big donors to beat down Bernie Sanders, right? And at the same time, you're having to run a political coalition with progressive Democrats. And so Biden didn't do what Hillary Clinton did, which was to shut Sanders completely out of everything, pretty much, after she won control of the party. They were pretty careful not to do that. So they actually did sort of run what one is I'm tempted to describe as normal coalitional politics with the progressive Democrats. They actually, they've actually tried to put people in charge of the Federal Trade Commission who actually believe in antitrust. No one had seen that in so long they can't remember. They didn't do much in the CDC for that, but all right, we'll pass over that one. But they did make serious efforts on a variety of other domestic policy dimensions, where, including the initial big stimulus package, the one that got Larry Summers and so many other people exercise. Now, their problem is that Biden wants to run for president again. He wants to get reelected. And they have in place all these programs that were, in effect, coalitional programs with progressive Democrats. But now they're trying to raise more than $1 billion new dollars. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that, in effect, the big no-no in American politics from
Just let me just jump in a sec. Raise $1 billion new dollars to pay for the new presidential campaign.
Yeah, they're running a presidential campaign. Yes, exactly. They want to. It's political money, is what we're talking about here. So they want that cash, and you just have to face the fact here. You may remember when Biden proposed to minimize the hit to the budget deficit by very modest new taxes on upper income groups and business. Not a single business organization in the United States supported that package. There was a lot of clucking in some quarters saying, well, that's really inconsistent, since they say they really like a lot of the stuff. There was even a substantial business support for, even some of the climate change legislation, certainly for all the tax credits and things that make that go. So, there's nothing inconsistent about that, actually, if you sort of sit around and think and you live in a money-driven political system. It's like, of course they want to have, tax credits to go green, if you like, for the people who favor that, not the legacy energy providers. We'll set them off to one side right now. But if you like that stuff, there's nothing inconsistent by just expecting the people in the United States to pay for that, too. In other words, you want the tax credits, but you won't pay for it. That's just big money politics. There's nothing puzzling about this. Now, the sort of perfect swindle on this from a Democratic side is to actually vote the stuff, come out in favor of it, and then do a deal much later where you take back much of the spending on the very poorest people. I mean, stuff about trying to make work requirements for eating and things like that. How low can we go? And the answer, of course, as we all know, is very low. But that's the sort of thing that it's sort of like it's a perfect swindle. That's when you do this. That's when they do this for 20 years, Paul, including, and note this, that when the same type of situation occurred, they needed a debt ceiling raise after the Trump taxes were put through. The Democrats just waved the tax cut through. They just did not seriously contest it. Obama did exactly the same thing in that fabled 2011, quote, compromise there, where most of the Bush tax cuts were put right in place. I remember I may even have talked to you about it at the time. It was just ridiculous. How crazy is this? Basically the Democratic line among big business, we'll call them corporate Democrats, which is certainly the majority of the presidential party and a big chunk of the Congress, is don't raise taxes on the rich. Do try to keep your credits going with your electorate, which, doesn't quite perceive this problem as you separated in time, and just keep going. I mean, it's perfect. I mean, you can't ask for better. And they do it. They've kept it for 20-some years. It's Groundhog Day all the time, every 2 years or so, to raise the limit. I mean, as to why did the Democrats, somebody put out a press release after we published our piece and said, why do the Democrats do Groundhog Day all the time? That's why.
The favored structure in Congress is one party controls the House, the other controls the Senate, so nothing serious can get done. The Wall Street loves that structural paralysis. When you get the odd time when one party controls both, when the Dems have had two opportunities, this gives you a second kick at the can for Wall Street and such to roll back any spending they don't like. But the underlying argument is the spending is inflationary. That's supposed to be why the Republicans are pushing so hard, and that's how they sell their positioning in all this. How inflationary is the spending, and is what was rolled back going to have any effect on inflation?
All right, what was rolled back? Well, I mean, especially when you sort of pick up the requirements for, in effect, what you're trying to do with the most famous one is add so many requirements for getting fed if you're able-bodied, that you just stop. You end up having to fill out forms and everything else. I mean, it's just denial of benefits by another name. Now, think about this for a second. If you think you have an aggregate demand problem driving inflation, which, a separate conversation, but they probably do. What kind of a dent are you going to make in that aggregate demand by just cutting some people off from some food aid, say, or failing to, say, make up the difference in inflation for lots of social programs? You're not going to make much of a dent at all. I mean, if you want to deal with your aggregate demand problem, a much simpler thing would be to, here I go back to the paper Servas Storm and I wrote. There's lots of ways to deal with this besides throwing people out of work. I mean, and to back up just a bit further, huge chunks of our current inflation haven't got anything to do with aggregate demand. There's supply shock after supply shock after supply shock. But there are a lot of wealthy people out there still spending, even after the decline in the markets, on the basis of rises, fairly long-term rises in either their home values or stock market values from the time they originally bought the stuff. I say that knowing perfectly well that markets also went down there. You could, if you want to sort of stop aggregate demand inflation, you're much better off telling people, okay, look, if you're rich, instead of throwing everybody out of work, we're going to make you buy some bonds. We'll pay you for the bonds. I'm not talking confiscation here. It's just the old Keynes how to pay for the war idea. And you could pull money from the rich out, and that's pretty easy to do. In theory, it's just politically, you might as well try to force all your water to run uphill or something like that. We know what the problem is with that, but you could do it. And, also, look, they are in effect hardly, I think not even on paper are they trying to cut defense spending. Everybody agrees that in the end, after you sort of move all the money around, that it's not going to be cut at all. That's inflationary too, isn't it? If you think that you have an aggregate demand side inflation, and I would agree there's some. That's why I would favor, what I just said, which is let's have people who are well off put some money away from spending right now. If you like, save for everybody, including themselves. We're going to pay them interest on that. That's what I do. That's why the whole inflation argument is just ridiculous. It hasn't got any role in this thing. And of course, the other move you could make is you could take back some of the Trump tax cuts. Now, they just somehow never get around to that. And yet Biden just, I mean, there are perfunctory noises followed by nothing. I mean, if the Democrats were interested in making a rise in the taxes cut by Trump an issue, it'd be pretty easy to tell us about it and create a public opinion spiral that would push on that. If you see any trace of this, you let me know, would you? I mean, you're sitting in Canada, so you can see the whole country at once, as it were. So you just tell me. I mean, don't make me laugh. This is just an unsympathetic being would say it's just scandalous. I'm old-fashioned, so I'm still appalled.
There were some senior voices in the Democratic Party, including Yellen at one point, who were for getting rid of the debt ceiling. And apparently, constitutionally, there's a fairly strong argument that the legislation itself is unconstitutional. Why did Biden so committed to this bipartisanship when clearly it doesn't play in the Democratic Party's favor electorally, other than money? What you're saying, but is it just money, or is there some electoral?
There might be a tiny advantage, but it's almost entirely to the Republicans anyway. There's a few folks around who still believe that deficits by their nature are unhealthy. There is, I think, a tiny voting block there, but that's already Republican. You're not going to gain a lot of votes there. No, I think this story is just, look, this is pretty, we have a problem, all right? Let me just sketch it for you. It's this. An enormous chunk of the business community doesn't trust Donald Trump. That's clear. Some of them even promised in the wake of the January 6th, 2021, storming of the Capitol, that they would even stop giving money to the Republicans who voted to, unelect Biden, if you like, if I may put it that way, just for clarity. Now, nearly all of them have, in fact, gone back on that pledge. I mean, they still just want to with the Republicans, but they don't trust Trump. So there's a very strong presumption that somebody like Biden, a basically conservative Democrat, long history of, when guys talk about cutting deals, what they mean, look, if that's not the kind of deals, they're not cutting social program deals, except generally to chop them there. So they're sort of are willing to live with Biden. If they, and particularly the Biden who can, but they are very suspicious of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And, the internal apparatus in the Democratic Party is itself very, and in the White House, very suspicious of that wing. I think a careful observer can see that they have tried repeatedly, in the off-year election and elsewhere, to sort of weaken the power of the progressive Democrats a lot. That while having to also run a coalition. If you like, in the short term, they try to satisfy them what they can, what they must, and in the long run, they try to whittle away their power. And so this is a real unstable combination. It's not guaranteed to stick around forever. After all, consider this: you're in an incredibly volatile, by its nature, atmosphere. What's the volatility? It's this. The overwhelming bulk of the population has lost big on inflation. Almost hardly anyone now is even trying to claim that inflation has been wage-led. I mean, you get these insane discussions, some of the weird ones. One of the weirdest was the Bernanke and Blanchard thing, where they basically said, well, it's not driven by wages, but on the other hand, that's what we really got to worry about. It's like, what? I mean, come on, why don't we go after like the things that actually are raising prices, of which, a profit-led inflation is a pretty obvious one. And But, we'll set that aside. That's, if you like, Brookings, and what do you expect? Okay. So there is that side. And it's not, in other words, like Biden has a lock on everybody's votes. I know the White House is sort of touting themselves as hugely worker-friendly, and they have done a lot of reasonable things at the National Labor Relations Board, for example. But you know what? The percentage of unionized workers has dropped every year Biden's been in power, and the losses on inflation in general are fairly substantial. That's a problem as you go into an election. And so I'm sure, I don't, look, this is pretty obvious. They say it often enough that you don't even have to reconstruct it. They think they need $1 billion to win this election. And that money is not going to be coming from the workforce that is getting squeezed by inflation.
Why do they need $1 billion to win this election? And let me just say, hang on. Let me add a piece to that. If some people suggest that if Hillary, when she ran against Trump, if she had actually vigorously spent money and campaigned in the swing states, Trump would never have won. Why does it take so much money to beat Trump? I know he got 75 million votes, but in terms of what's happened in Pennsylvania in the last election, what happened in Michigan, it doesn't look all that great for Trump.
No, well, all right, just as a matter of fact, right? I mean, I haven't looked this week, but when I last looked in the polls, Trump was running ahead of Biden, and sometimes.
Well, then the question, why Biden?
Well, yes, that is.
Does Wall Street want Biden?
There's lots of Wall Street guys saying we don't want the choice between Biden and Trump. They'd like, look, they said this last week, right? I mean, it was there. I think William Ackman started it, but there were lots of folks writing it up, and the burst of media frenzy showed you had a sort of little burgeoning tempest not a tempest, I don't want to say a mass movement because I think he'd get 1% of the vote, but Jamie Dimon for president, There's a lot of folks that think Biden is in danger of going too far to the left. What they really mean by that usually is they don't like the Democratic Party. They don't trust it. It has a strong progressive wing right now. And they don't like having to deal with that. They'd really like to have a sort of center-right Republican. There's only one problem with that. You know what it is that Trump keeps going up in the polls in that strange universe called the Republican electorate. It really is a parallel universe, and in this world, he's a potential winner. Just look at what does he refer to, the sanctimonious, the governor of Florida, DeSantis can't even get.
But are the Dems worried that Wall Street will go back to supporting Trump? When you go back to January 6th, the doors of Congress were breached at 2:10 in the afternoon. At 3:10 in the afternoon, something happened which was reported but is never talked about since. The National Association of Manufacturers issued a press release actually calling on Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove Trump. And, they were the biggest lobbyist pro-Trump organization for the 4 years he was president, up until his refusal to transfer power. I mean, would the corporate elites really switch back to Trump again?
Now, this allows me to actually set right now, no. But picture this. First question. Nobody knows how deep the recession is going to be. That's a huge imponderable. All right. Then there is, of course, the question about how much the Democrats are going to try to make themselves over as Republicans. I am among those. In fact, I may have invented the argument in some readings of that, that thought that Hillary Clinton really fell down there thanks to Obama. I do think that 2011 deal with Obama, which took some years to really kick in because it was constraining spending going forward for quite some time, did face, in the eyes of a lot of people. I actually read every single one of the American National Election Survey interviews in 2016. And there were a bunch of people there just obviously saying, we don't see, including some I remember from black women, who were just saying, we don't see any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Other people did, and a lot of people did maybe after the election. But they didn't see it at the time in terms of the policy, particularly if you're sort of looking mostly at contrasting the policy you just experienced with, what somebody's promising. I think Biden did start this. I don't think the deal was as bad as it could have been started out talking about. In that respect, I think they didn't collapse the differences between the parties in the way Obama did, for example, on a lot of spending programs. If you're asking me, this is a clinical appraisal now. But the Democrats have probably hurt themselves with their electorate, I think, and that will, over the next year, become even more obvious.
But go back to this question with the corporate elites who, as I suggested, one of their most important lobbying organizations actually called for Pence to remove Trump. Will these same elites go back to Trump?
In a deep recession, and if it looked like that, here's the other, was a real element of instability here that nobody talks about, but which is obvious, which is, look, you're now into your sort of third year or so of inflation running ahead of wages, mostly. At the very poorest, wages have come up for reasons that had nothing to do with federal policy. We can do that some other time or even later now if you want. I mean, you couldn't get anybody to be a nursing home person when you were being paid little, and it turned out to be very dangerous. I mean, that which was not on anybody's radar when they were doing low-wage jobs before 2020. All right, we'll set that out to one side. Those can't. But the rest, people are losing 3 years in a row. You may see a strike wave. There's a lot of evidence of all kinds of small strikes, some bigger strikes once in a while. The railroad worker strike is real obvious. And, that was settled by the Biden administration on terms in favor of the employers. And this stuff could destabilize folks. And a strike wave in a deep recession, you could see almost anything happen. I hesitate to mention the specter of Weimar, but this one has a sort of look of that thing. I mean, that is to say, you have a substantial progressive group of people in one party. The leader of the country that is only partly on their side, mostly in the Weimar case, totally opposed. But on the other hand, on the other side, well, Brand X, with a different, altogether different twist. I think things are pretty actually weird. If there were a sort of VIX index for instability, it would, in politics, that you could easily calculate, I'd say this thing is much dicier than people think. I repeat the point. We don't know how, in a deep recession with a strike wave that could strengthen the progressive faction, that's what happened in the New Deal. I mean, look, it's worth making this point because of all this junk about how, I see all these contrasts between Roosevelt and Biden, generally, obviously, to the detriment of Biden. But actually, Roosevelt had to be pushed into moving left in 35 and 36 after the collapse of the first New Deal and a strike wave then surged. That's what actually happened. I've written a lot about this in my papers on the New Deal. The strike wave often, drops out in a lot of discussions, not in most historians, but in political studies. They don't tend to take that much account of it. They should. And if Biden falls down a couple more times, you may see an effort to find somebody else. Now, you heard it here first. I think they'll go for a Democratic governor who appears to be far from the madding crowd in Washington. And, he'll probably be a he.
Could be a she from Michigan.
if I had a bet, I'd say Gavin Newsom is the first one, but that's just me. I mean, I could be wrong about that. This is a clinical judgment from a light year away, and light for stars that haven't actually begun to shine yet. But this could happen. I think this is the most labile and unstable political situation I think I've ever seen.
Is Biden, you think Biden's hanging on purely for personal reasons, like he just wants to be president again, or is Wall Street saying you're the only one we can really get behind?
I think both. A lot of people in the White House wanting to stay in, he wants to stay in, and there's a constituency to see he's electable. They clearly think that they can beat Trump. They are basically calculating, I think, that the abortion issue will help them a lot, which I think it will. In a deep recession, it may not be enough. And I repeat the point that nobody in the White House, and for that matter, nobody in Congress really, can control what the sort of reactions are on the streets as inflation just persists. I mean, right now, you got lots of people saying it's going to drop. I think it's going to drop too. Well, let's see how much it does and see what happens. And particularly, the White House moved way too fast to roll back all of the special provisions that they put in place under COVID. And in particular, the business about allowing people to do medical tests and paying for medical tests, that stuff's virtually all gone now. And in effect, this is tough. I've seen it hyperbolized this way, but it's very clear. As you just say it, they were almost running a small European welfare state for a while under COVID. You could actually, if you needed medical tests, you could get them. And you could actually get the treatment you needed too. That stuff is all gone now. And yes, COVID hasn't disappeared, but neither is just all kinds of other normal medical stuff. And we haven't seen how people will react to this, and particularly as their real wages erode. This is a very interesting situation. I want to focus on that, the erosion of real wages, the possibility of strike waves. I mean, there's clearly a lot of small strikes happening. And we're just getting into the summer.
Oh. All right. Thanks very much, Tom.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis-news. Don't forget the donate button and subscribe to the email list. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. If you're on podcasts, you can still come over to the website and donate.